Welcome to the Brute Strength Podcast, bringing you worldwide experts from all areas of health and fitness. We cover training, nutrition, coaching, and mindset. Welcome your host, strength and conditioning coach, 2012 and 2013 CrossFit Games champ, Michael Cazayoux. Mind, body, brute.
Hey, and welcome back. My name is Mike Cazayoux, and you're listening to the Brute Strength Podcast. This week's guest is Cody Burkhart. Cody is an engineer for NASA with a laundry list of a resume. He's currently working on something called the ARED, Advanced Resistive Exercise Device Project. And in general, he goes into much more detail about this on the show, but he's building an immersive resistance training feedback system. So think virtual reality meets resistance training meets gaming. He's trying to, as closely as possible, mimic the demands of what astronauts will experience in space to prepare them for all of the demands. He also holds multiple black belts in martial arts, including a 3rd degree in Taekwondo. He was a regional competitor in 2012. This is just a crazy successful guy, and he is the reason that I was so fascinated with him is he's incredibly thoughtful. So think about what it must take to have this type of job at NASA, and he applies that same level of thinking to training and to recovery and to mindset. And so that's what I was really interested in talking to him about. We start the show out talking about some of the fascinating stuff he does with NASA. We talked about what he's learned from years of martial arts and how that applies to all sports. We talk about breathwork strategies for increased performance. And we spend a lot of the conversation talking about mastery, what that really means, how that's been lost in our society, and how you can get on the path of mastery. Before we get the show started, my love language is words of affirmation. So if you love this show, if you've been listening for a while and haven't done so already, I would really appreciate it if you would head to iTunes, leave me a quick review, even tell a friend about it, have them subscribe. That would mean a lot. Enjoy the show. Cody, what's up, man? How are you?
I'm doing great. How about yourself, sir?
I'm good, dude. I've been really looking forward to this. You are a complete badass. As I was doing my research on you, when I reached out to you, I knew that you were an engineer for NASA. You were extremely into health and fitness and have an extremely bright mind in those fields. But as I was researching you, I found out that you had several black belts in different martial arts, including a 3rd degree in Taekwondo. You were a college cheerleader at UC Boulder, and you're just an incredibly successful and thoughtful human being. So I'm really excited to get into this.
I appreciate it. Thank you. It sounds cooler when you say it all in one strip, but they were, I think, important parts of my life, and I've enjoyed each of them very thoroughly.
It's very impressive, man. So let's start out here. If you really wanted to blow someone's mind with what you're doing at NASA, what would you say? How would you explain it in terms that the layman like myself can understand?
What we are trying to do as far as a vision right now is to generate a exercise system. Again, you have to remember kind of the context here. You're in a small capsule. You're intending to be in deep space.
You being an astronaut in a spaceship.
Correct. So our end group, right, is intended to be in a small capsule. And for the sake of this conversation, again, just using yourself, right? Put yourself in this. You're in essentially a dorm room with 3 of your not necessarily closest friends, and you're going deep into space, and it has been described as, pure, empty blackness, devoid of all light, right? So it is a very intimidating situation, and it's a very intimidating situation where there's not a lot of materials that you can bring and not a lot of space that's available. And so how do you try and get astronauts yourself in shape, not only physically, but a mentally viewed lens, perceptually, such that you feel an attachment to things. So all of this kind of stems into our scenario. We have to then fit into this bucket. And so what we are trying to devise and build is the ability to create an immersive exercise system. Imagine that you now have, virtual reality inputs, you have audio inputs, you have EMS skin inputs, almost like if you've seen Ready Player One, the idea of being, in a fully haptic environment, you don't at that point have an entirely clear separation between what is reality and what is virtual reality. How can you take that immersive system and make it more capable at hosting your needs as an individual? How can I then start gathering your physiological symptoms and signals, as well as the environmental conditions that you're in, and then start processing those to make the best choices possible? Because it's not going to be a cardiologist who comes in as the motherboard and makes all choices based on your heart rate. I have to have a system that is unbiased, that is just looking for the relationships as devised by those experts, and then power weighting them against each other. It has to be, essentially what your brain does. It's us. So how do you make you a really smart and masterful trainer for yourself, and then also remove all bias, right? It's like almost impossible, but that's what we're trying to do. And we're trying to humanize that data such that these crew members can make some introspective change, because I can't just force you to be something, right? If I try and change you, as they say, I'm not going to be successful. So how do I make you want to change and realize those changes? That's what we're trying to build right now.
And so you're building this system that lives on land for them to train, to prepare them for space, or is this also something that lives on the spaceship or on the rocket?
The end goal will be that it'll be on orbit, so an actual flight project. And as that process goes along, you create what are considered ground analogs. But I will admit, based on my own personal experience and working with the individuals that I have had the opportunity to work with, we are much more on the lens that this system needs to be here, it needs to be where you're going, and it needs to be in the middle, or at least the information feeding into that system, whether or not it's the exact type of system, right? You want to be able to have that pre, intra, post, because then I'm going to be able to understand what the implications are to our end goal. And our end goal is task performance. You should be able to do your job. If you're able to do your job in the healthiest, most resilient way possible, we've achieved our goal. It's not about being the strongest person there. It's not having the fastest 2K, right? It's, can you do shit that you need to do when shit gets real? And that's a challenge, because it is individually biased, and that each person will respond differently. So again, having one on the ground gives you a whole lot of research information. We have what's considered a low N, right? We got an N of 10, only 10 astronauts kind of thing. We don't have many people on orbit at all times. So for us to be able to make the system smarter, we're going to have to design ground versions of it and look at how we can gather data points from a vast populace to help smooth over those functions and make the system smarter of itself. So
you use the term power weighted. We power weight things in our assessment when we bring someone on, right? We know that to do well in the CrossFit Open, what you snatch is one of, if not the most important thing. It shows up in every single event. Actually, now that I'm saying this, I don't know if we saw it this year, but it's been one of the most consistently tested movements. Whereas a strict pull-up, while it does contribute to overall success in CrossFit, it's not nearly as important as what you snatch or what you clean and jerk, or say how many muscle ups you can do, right? And so when we do an assessment, and I'm not explaining this to you, I'm just explaining this kind of for the listener. Obviously, you know what this is. But when we're assessing someone, if they do poorly on a strict pull-up test versus a strict or versus a snatch test, that doesn't make nearly as much of a difference. And so we take that into account when we're assessing them and putting them into certain training groups or giving them a training program. What are some of can you go a little more in depth on like what are the most important things that you're looking at, and just go a little more in depth on how you power weight those things without talking about too much physics?
So I would say that most people want to have the answer that, okay, we're using heart rate variability, we're using temperature, and we're using skin conductance. Boom, boom, boom. Those are the three measures you should care about. I don't believe that's the right way. Now, I do have an absolute passion for data and the ability to try and understand how these systems work together. But it's more so saying in the particular context, right? What are my objectives? And if my objective, again, is task performance, I'm going to power weight the response to, say, a random test of their ability to perform a function underneath stress, as opposed to, power weighting it towards a snatch value. I don't care in this case how much they can snatch. I do, however, care that they're receiving sufficient loading to their muscle structure. And I want to make sure that their bones are also receiving that load. And so I might be looking at how much the density changes of those particular bone masses, things like the pelvic bone.
Why does that matter to these guys?
So particularly from the pelvic piece, you got to think about how much load you take in a given day. Standing, sitting, all of these different things that you're doing, you are putting load, most particularly down your legs. A lot of us are in that position. So our legs are used to seeing consistent and constant loading. When you start talking about bones, the osteoclast, osteoblast relationship, what I'm looking for is I'm looking for local fractures of the bone such that my body then decides to regrow that area and make it more dense.
Which is typically happening all day long, right, every single day when we're on Earth.
Right. You've got stability tissues pulling on it. You got major muscle movers pulling on it. You got a bunch of different things that are putting that damage on there, because as you contract a muscle or use it, right, you're putting force and load onto those areas, and that's going to cause that local damage. When you're in space, imagine now that you're only training for 2 hours a day, you only have up to 2 hours worth of loading. So 22 hours of your day are unloaded. And that means that those places that are used to seeing high load over a long period of time that have built up lots of bone density to handle that aren't that way. So if you stack that, for instance, in the case of the pelvic, right? If I have pelvic bone loss, and then I also have a separation of my spine because now I'm elongated, I'm not stacked by the weight of gravity in my poor positions and standing and hunched over, right? So now all of a sudden these compressed discs that we're used to seeing a lot of lumbar loads start to open themselves up. So that's fine, and it's not a problem. But what happens when you try and go to do re-entry? Now you're talking about anywhere between 8 and 10 G's worth of force. That's a whole lot of load to put on the body that hasn't really seen much load over time. And so those locations where the bone might be thinner, where the vertebrae might be separated, right? I don't want to see any types of shear loads on a vertebrae anyways. Mm-hmm. But if I do get a shear load, how do I stabilize around that? How do I build that structure? So it's important that I'm seeing and weigh in on trying to have heavy load on my crew. So that's going to be a guaranteed mandatory thing that I have to have. I need to have the ability to load heavily on the crew in those various fulcrum points that I know that I've seen degradation in before. So that's what I mean kind of by the power weight. And there's a secondary version of the power weight, which is over time, these algorithms are going to start to create relationships from an individual and then from a gross high level standpoint. Just because the standard deviation says most people should follow in here, you can be several sigma off to the side. It is going to be unique to you. So I may power weight based on that group mentality that says, by in effect, most of the time, if you look at your value of EDA, electrodermal activity, I am able to more accurately understand how much stress you receive during the day. Let's say that's my statement. However, maybe somebody doesn't respond well from an EDA standpoint, and I want to be looking at, heart rate and heart rate variability. What if it's, I'm now instead looking at how their muscle tissue recovers or what their stress biomarkers are in their blood. That's a very different picture, and the more information that I can provide to that engine, slowly it's going to start to create its own weights, and I'll start to be able to see things that pop out, just like you've done, right? You did the analysis of the snatch and the pull-up. The way to do that analysis was to say, let's ignore what CrossFit is for a moment, and let's just look at the movements. And let's say if this movement shows up X number of times, it's more important. That means you're going to reshape your algorithm based upon that. So you're going to spend more time working on those muscle patterns and those chains to improve that technique and skill, because it's going to have the highest bang for your buck. I want to know what's the highest bang for my buck if I'm a computer system trying to solve for a crew member. How do I optimize their performance? Again, reflecting back on that task performance goal.
So your guys aren't following a free blog online, right?
No, we're not.
You're making a huge case for individual program design.
When we get back to the mastery concept,
yeah,
I have something to say about that, because I was thinking about it today, and it's a perfect element to bring up later.
Cool. So obviously next I want to talk about poop.
Okay.
You have a cool story about your son Knox and you working out and something with an ice bath. Tell me the story.
Cool. He won't find it as cool.
One day.
Yeah, one day. One of the individuals that I've had a privilege of working around and thinking hard thoughts with is a gentleman named Josh Figuered. And a couple summers ago, he and I were trying to do a bunch of what I'll call is testing of the limits of the physiological responses that we read about and researched about. And one of those is the mammalian dive reflex. And so, in case you don't know what that is, whenever your face meets water, essentially, and cold increases it. And if water goes up your nose, even better. And if you have water in your mouth, ironically, even better. But you basically go through changes on the physiological side to help protect yourself, because it anticipates that you are now essentially diving into the water, in which it's going to be smarter to change its faculties.
And
we wanted to see.
Correct me if I'm wrong, but humans are unique in some way in regards to the mammalian dive reflex, right? Or do all mammals have it in the same way?
I wouldn't say that they all have it in the same way. As far as the particularity of humans versus others, I don't know the specifics.
Okay, I don't know what I'm thinking.
I was more focused on things like, if you hold your breath long enough, as an example, you'll get to a phase, if you hold it long enough, where you'll actually feel your spleen dump extra oxygen-rich blood, because it holds on to this reserve. It's basically its self-defense mechanism. Fish use this an awful lot in high dive mammals. But once you feel it, it almost feels like that second wind, where you're like, oh, it's like a rush. And to try and understand that mechanism and how that mechanism is improved relative to water was always something that we had been interested in, because if I know that my body has a particular set of physiological reactions to a stimulus, what can I do if I add that stimulus to my training, right? So I know that my body is going to batten down the hatches, become smarter with oxygen, and try and deal with its CO2 in a more refined way, because it thinks I'm going underwater and it now wants to save itself. What if I time that with my training, right? Yeah. So if I do an anaerobic threshold and I'm starting to peak out CO2, what happens if I shove my face in water?
So you were specifically interested in this for your own maybe physical performance and basically knowledge about how this applies to physical performance?
Correct. It was not about, so the way that I've always tried to coach relative to athletes is I want to try it first. Because if I don't really know what I'm talking about and I just read it in a book, you shouldn't trust me, right? Sure. And even if I do read about it and it works great for me and I apply it for you and it sucks, okay, it sucks, right? We got to figure out what works for you. And my job is to try and battle test as many things as I can, such that I come equipped with, okay, this is why it didn't work, or this is how we can presume it should have worked, or where we thought it was going to work, and this is what we saw. And so from a standpoint of that, it was kind of what we have always called N=1, right? Using yourself as a self-experiment. And in this case, Josh and I had read a whole piss ton of information on mostly him relative to the mammalian dive reflex. And we've been doing the cold and at the time, had discussions of Wim Hof, and those pieces all kind of congealed into this conversation of what actually happens when you control the respiration quality of your body, and how does that, impact your training. Can you teach yourself to recover faster if you allow yourself to remove from the moment? So an example, if I'm doing an anaerobic threshold and I'm just burning the candle on both ends, trying to go as hard as I can, when I'm done, I'm sucking for wind. That is my first primary, right? And as I like to say, it's Eli Manning, a mouth breather. Mm-hmm. You immediately go into, right? And CrossFitters are notorious for being mouth breathers. But this is a big problem, because as soon as I start mouth breathing, I'm basically over oxygenating my system and not really doing as much as I think that I'm doing. If I can get myself to actually go through my nasal breath and create positive pressure relative to my lungs, I can get more oxygen transfer in my body. Big piece being, most people think that most of your oxygen comes on the in, but you got to think about it. There's time that has to happen inside of you to make that gas exchange. So what really creates most of the exchange of getting fresh oxygen in and pulling CO2 out is actually that exhalation, particularly through my sinuses. If I breathe through my sinuses, I've got a smaller hole now, right? So I have an increased back pressure relative to my lungs to help force things into my alveoli. And relative to how the Bohr effect works as far as the affinity of oxygen CO2, I'm getting all those benefits. So a lot of my oxygen transfer and a lot of my CO2 clearing to reduce that acidity load that most people try and flag as why I'm hurt and can't work out anymore, right? They call it lactic acid. It's not it. It's the increased, acidity relative to those hydrogen ions that are coming off of that. So if I'm in that situation, I want to be able to breathe, but instead I have somebody coming off a bike going, well, what if I shove your face in water? What if I initiate your sequence to go into that realm of trying to shut down and compartmentalize things? Can I get you to calm down your breathing quicker such that I would then have an impact to your training? So that's basically our hypothesis. And to test this out, we were on an assault bike just going for broke. And as soon as we were done, we would shove our face into an ice bucket of water and basically try and then measure our recovery rates relative to SpO2 and heart rate afterwards to see if it had changed or improved our recovery rates versus just coming off the bike and nasal breathing versus just coming off the bike and allowing ourselves to breathe how we wanted to. So needless to say, it was a focused experiment that involved lots of pain and suffering. And I pulled my face up from the bucket of water. And the way that my house is shaped is that when the garage door is open and the back door is open, you can see all the way through to the backyard.
Gotcha.
And I see my son in the middle of taking a shit in the lawn. And it was just one of those realizations where you're like, no, this literally isn't happening right now.
This can't happen right now.
So I sprinted into the backyard and I was like, no, why? And he was like, I couldn't find the bathroom. I'm going to give you an idea. That's the door and that's the bathroom. And it's right next to it.
Right.
And he just in that moment got entirely stressed out, couldn't think about what to do. And as I'm trying to have a conversation with him, Josh had brought his roommate's dog and he was, heavy panting. And I was like, oh, go away, Rufus, go away. I'm like, man, your breath smells like, oh no.
Oh no.
So then I had to go tell Josh, I was like, listen, Josh, on top of my son pooping in the middle of the lawn, I apologize to tell you that you might want to not let this dog lick you for fun right now, because I think he ate my son's, waste out in the backyard. It was interesting, but I mean, it really did teach me something too. In that moment, he was essentially kind of like us. He was in a high stress state. At that time, playing was more important than anything else. He had 3 dogs in the backyard, which is one more than he had before. It was a super fun. Everyone wants to play catch. He's doing those things. And then all of a sudden his body's, in a demand situation saying, you need to figure out this problem now. Otherwise we are going to have a big issue. It's the same thing as being in a training. And all of a sudden you're like, we need to figure out this problem now. And you got to figure it out. The problem, or the difference I should say, is how many more skills did I have versus how many more skills did he have? Mm-hmm. And I think that that's reflected in a lot of, just human principles. Somebody is more resilient who has more capabilities and skill sets, not just internally and automatically, but also from the ability to, have reality in a perceptual state to say, here's what I can and cannot control. Here's what I can and cannot do. As adults, we get more of them, or so you hope you get more of them. Mm-hmm. But if you, in your training and in all of your principles, always resort back to the same select few, have you really given yourself, a wider volume of solutions to be able to manage more conflict? And, as a kid, you're going to learn the ability to find out the restroom and know to go to the restroom sooner. But when you're a kid, that's, low priority. High priority is all the sensual information that you're trying to pull out from the world, and you get addicted to it. So
going back to your experiment, are you finding or are you seeing high level endurance athletes using that technique, using only their nose? And if they're not, are you suggesting that they do that?
Absolutely. So I can speak part and post to what I've done, and then I'll kind of suggest off the other piece. The suggest off the other piece is the stuff that Brian and Rob Wilson have done right now relative to PSE for the breathing stuff. It's definitely worth checking out.
That's Brian McKenzie, guys.
Yeah, they've done a great job at being able to break down all these breathing studies and different wisdoms that they've gained throughout the practice with themselves. And they've even released a new gear program. And there's a lot of, really popular CrossFitters that use it. Tia Claire Toomey, she's one of the individuals that uses it. That it's not something where by any means is it replacing all of your training. It's just, an ancillary boost. How do you try and help think about breathing a little bit more effectively? So what I've had the luck of working with Guy Petroselli, who's a pro Duke athlete for a long time now. And I use the breathing stuff with him and have for years. We'll make sessions where he's only allowed to breathe nasal the entire time. That's it. So he cannot, decide to go, when I say a nasal TT, that's not a regular TT, right? That's how time trial. How hot can you run your engine for a mile when all you have is your nose? And doesn't just test your functional capability to handle oxygen and CO2, but it tests the mechanism and the structure. Do you have the ability to use your nasal cavities properly? He had an awful lot of sinus infections for a really long time and got a whole bunch of updates, modifications done to help support that. And he's done much more successfully with it. We do other situations where, you'll have to do an exhale hold and then do work underneath it. Stuff from like the Oxygen Advantage is a good example of a book that has information on this. And these are things that have been tested wide spectrum. I tape my mouth at night. I tape my son's mouth at night. He wants to have it taped, but I suggest it to the athletes as well, trying to get them to recreate this pattern that nasal breathing is the most appropriate way to do it. How do you get them to breathe through the diaphragm intelligently? If I watch a fighter, the first person who opens their mouth, that's it, right? That's kind of your golden sign to say that person has less cardiovascular control, because right now they've had to switch into a new environment of breathing in order to maintain the arousal that they're in. That's a big thing, especially if you've caught them at, early in a round and all of a sudden they're gassing. Play games where you force them to use more of it to stay high while you stay low. So these principles are not new by any means. They've been used by yoga for a long time in different ways. They've been used by fighters and martial arts for a long time. But it's now trying to get people to realize that they do exist. It is cool that you have an automatic function like breathing that you can manually grab when you want to. It's like being in a high performance sports car, right? The sports car wants to know what it's going to do for you, and it's going to make some smart decisions, but ultimately it's controlled by an algorithm that's plugged into the computer that says, under these conditions, this is when you're going to shift. But maybe you're out trying to hit the switchbacks your own way. And so you want to, switch from a manual mode into an automatic mode into a manual mode. This is the paddle shifting capability. How can you change that into something where you can use it? If I want to be able to pass somebody right now, how can I move myself into an anaerobic breath scenario to help pump myself through this and then recover quickly back to that, parasympathetic state where the aerobic activity piece to try and cool my body back down so that I don't ride too hot. If I ride too hot, I burn out my glycogen and I bonk. We've seen it too many times, and athletes doing so well and they come out moving hot and all of a sudden just right? So how do I get somebody to realize that, to feel that, and then have the tools to change that breathing pattern in order to make them more effective at what they're doing?
Yeah, we really take it for granted that we can only breathe one way, right? Or that we don't have to think about our breathing, because when we're going about our day, we really don't have to think about it. But what if we could have these different skills and different tools in our toolbox, as you're kind of putting it, to go faster, to recover faster, whatever it may be. I love that. What's the best resource you would recommend people start with to dive into learning about the breath?
Man, there's just so many. I think that Brian and Rob have created a really great camp with the art of breath.
Yeah.
And if you have an opportunity when it comes into town, it's worth checking out. Again, we all kind of highlight the Oxygen Advantage quite often. It's just a solid book, and it really does give you kind of not just how it works, but tools to prepare yourself. And from there, honestly, just Google breathing and you'll be surprised at how deep and how far it is now. It's, kind of one of those new secret sauces, the thing that not a lot of people talked about for a long time. And all of a sudden, as it becomes popular, you realize who's all doing it and you're just shocked. Mm-hmm. You're like, oh my gosh, I didn't even think about that. So I think those are two quick, simple solutions to start with.
Perfect.
Get an Audible, listen to it. That's what we did. It was nice and easy for Knox. I mean, even my 7-year-old son listened to it and pulled information out of it and asked questions about it. And it even gives you recommendations on how to help with your children and how to get them to be involved with it. So you're not teaching them the principles, because you have to remember they're watching us, right? So when you say during the day, you don't have to think about it much, my argument is you do. Right. So since we've been talking about breathing through your nose, this is just me watching you, right? You've been changing some of the facial patterns that you have to get different breaths. Mm-hmm. When you're reminded of it, when you think about it actively, you start to change and apply those.
Absolutely.
So why not try and ponder it more times during the day? Make it something where you do some exhale holds on walks in between buildings at work, or, I don't necessarily say do too many exhale holds while you're driving, but some of them aren't so bad. You can find places to do it, but you should be actively participating in it. Otherwise, you're letting that automatic function, that thing that you've built over time by watching everyone around you, control it. And if you've seen everyone breathe through their mouth, automatically start breathing through mouth when they're tired. That's the drawing feature that you've seen throughout your whole life. That's going to be exactly what you apply when it comes push to shove.
Since sports have been a thing in general, since athletic performance has been so highly valued by humans, everybody's looking for a competitive advantage. Everyone is focused on the physical, right? Like what's the perfect program for me? What's the perfect recovery mechanism or tool? This is one of those things that can give you an actual competitive advantage that's not going to tear up more muscle tissue and cause you to, take more days off. This kind of stuff, mindset work, it's stuff that you can do every single day that I truly believe will carry over into much more areas of your life than just your performance.
I absolutely agree with you, and something to kind of leverage off that when you talk about mindset and breathing. Remember too that in these functions where you're learning to breathe appropriately, you're learning to deal with arousal states of all kinds. So it's not just your training mentality. It's not just you got on the bike and now you're riding, and so now we want to think about nasal breathing. You get ticked off, in traffic. Breathe it out, man. They always tell you to take deep, slow breaths. That's not really it. It's focused breaths of the specific type, trying to understand how you can benefit your brain and feed it the oxygen that it wants to have and get rid of the CO2 that it doesn't want to have, and allow yourself to find that clarity. Activates catecholamines, changes the entire brain chemistry. There are so many different benefits to realizing that these kinds of little tools are broadly applicable. And it's not just to the big T training of those 2 hours in the gym each day. It's the little T training of the entire day, your life.
Boom. I love it. I love that distinction too between big deep breaths and just focused breaths, because you can be just sucking wind through your nose, and if you're still thinking about that dickhead that just cut you off, you're not really doing anything, right? But if you intently focus on your breath and allow yourself to feel whatever emotion you're feeling without continuing to create a story about whatever happened, then you can actually let go, right? That's
the emotions and story piece. That's
we'll get into it.
Perfect word choice.
Yeah. So let's talk martial arts. When did you start practicing?
I was like 4 or 5 years old when I started.
At what point did you become conscious of going from practicing rather than just playing martial arts?
I would say that for me, it's harder to reflect back on that. Most particularly because it's just so long ago, but that's where the benefit of, family comes in, the people that were there witnessing, watching what you were doing. And it just seems as though from a very early age, I was extremely focused on it and treated it very rigidly. I've looked back through pictures and I'm like, man, I look really mad all the time. But even though I felt like maybe relative to form structures and movement positions and things like that I was a little bit more focused early on. I would say that when I left for a few years from Colorado where we were, and we went to Minnesota for a few years, and that's when I did Sobak-do karate for a while. So just a different format. And then I came back and I was about 14 years old. And I think that's when things started to really change, at least for me. I started to realize a lot more of the relationships, that an isometric movement, a slow, for instance, hand crossing pattern inside of a form was not about that flashy technique or what it looked like, but it was developing now muscle structures designed to allow you to grab somebody's hands off of a lapel and shear them off of you. That each form, position, and movement was designed to not only be a strike, but a protection and a block, and also a transition into a new move. Why you spend so much time working on chambers for a low block. When I say chambers, for people who aren't used to it, how I actually hold my hands before the strike. What does that resemble? It's so cool when you start to realize that legitimately every single technique, if you were to break it down into the small pieces, it hides so many different flavors of useful and applicable skill sets just within itself. If I consider a down block where I'm chambering it up high and then blocking down low over my leg, I'm working on a dismantle for a hand, right? Somebody's got my wrist and I'm now grabbing it and pulling it off of myself. I could be working on trying to, again, just develop that low blocking power for something that's coming in. I could also be using it as a strike for a transition to another position as I open up my body into a strike position for my dominant side. There's so many different things that started to layer themselves upon each other. I think it was at that time, relative to my own intellectual curiosity with the world, I started getting into more big end topics in school, really driving into physics and chemistry and all these pieces where you start seeing these gigantic ecosystems collide essentially. And I think that's when things started to become different, when it was not just about going there to kick and punch and key up and have fun, but it was there about how can I learn the skill and what can I take away from it for everything that I'm doing.
So at some point you got into CrossFit, and I know you competed at a really high level. You qualified for regionals in 2012. I think that CrossFit.com, CrossFit HQ, I know this. I know that the philosophy is quality over quantity, right? That like the intention is to have quality movement over intensity. However, because things are timed and we're working out, versus other people, that is not what we usually see, especially in the highest level competition. I think we're trending towards higher quality because it's a competitive advantage, but most people are still just they're trying to go faster than they're really capable of using proper movement. What do you have to say to people that are athletes, whether it be in CrossFit or anything else, given what I just said and knowing what you know through your martial arts experience, on focusing on skill level first?
This will also be a good one to play for the mastery piece, because I was pondering it today with my son. So my son and I were playing catch earlier.
You ponder some cool shit with your son, by the way.
Yeah, he's pretty cool. And he's throwing, it's like a gator skin ball, like the old school dodgeball that you had in like gym class. And I threw it a little bit faster than he did. And then suddenly his next throw was escalated, right? And off target. And I reminded him, skill first, speed later, right? As you start throwing the ball, ratchet it up slowly. And if it gets too out of bounds, then tighten it back down and then practice in those areas. And so he threw a couple throws that got increasingly faster and faster and faster until he almost smashed into another frame on the wall. And I was like, all right, we've gone too far. That's kind of the piece that you need to realize when you're training, right? There is a speed that you can maintain, and that speed can be improved. And that speed is going to require you to push through some conventional blocks of the mind that have been designed to protect you, right? Pain was designed by your brain very intelligently to say, hey, so I don't know if you know this, but what you're doing is forcing me to have to change. So if you want to continue doing this, we're going to have to adapt. So I'm trying to minimize how much work we have to do in general as a species, as a thing, organism. I shouldn't say species. As an organism, I'm going to try and minimize it. So the best way for me to do that is to tell you, this hurts. We don't need to change. Let's just be who we are. We're fine right here.
Right.
And there's another, wall that people often forget, and that's the, puke and pass out wall, right? Your brain and your body has a function. When you go too hard, if you really have gone too hard, your body will shut down. That's its objective, right? Because it gets to a point where it's like, hey, listen, I tried to help you. I tried to give you your space, and now you're just getting silly. And I'm gonna shut this engine down. There's a huge gap between those two. Something that a lot of people don't, I think, recognize, in the fact that you can still experience pain and discomfort, but be managing quality and speed at those times. It's when you start to break down into dysfunctional patterns that don't benefit you, that aren't good. Now, in a competition scenario, right, it's regionals right now. Cool, go hard. But just remember that every time that you decide to break into a bad position, where are you in the weekend? Where are you in your own space? Where are you in your recovery? Because you need to know all those things. You are more than welcome to go into a tissue that's compensatory and use it and abuse it if you know that you can handle that. And that's not to say handle it like in the fact of a lot of people like, I just always work out this way, bro. I'm just always so hardcore. No, you're not in that way. Because there's an entirely different element of stress and adrenaline and changes when you're in that competitive floor. You haven't necessarily been there all the time. And so you need to have those kind of skills going into it. And I think that's where the martial arts piece does well. I don't entirely feel like every fight is a fight that I could win. I am trained to do decently well in many of those situations, and I feel like I have confidence in them, but I still don't actively go looking for a fight, right? Instead, I still want to make sure I practice the skills and the basics and the qualities of those movements, so that way when, real time happens, I can go real time. When we start talking about athletes and training, particularly in a sport like CrossFit, it's easy to say, I'm going to try and achieve this short. And that's where I say that, depending on when you want to have this mastery conversation, this is a big one. And the fact that the goal is not to trim the process of mastery and skill. To me, I think the goal should be, even though society has made the goal, trimming it right now, right? Everyone, I'm going to be faster, stronger, quicker now, tomorrow. This 5-minute routine is going to save your life, right? But instead, how can you dive deeper? How can you get yourself to use the tools around you, not to make the process faster, but to make the process deeper, to make it effective across more realms of who you are? When you talk about a pull-up and a snatch, to go back to something you talked about earlier, both are weighted in their own caliber. And while the snatch may not matter, the snatch matters and the pull-up may not. What if the pull-up suddenly does matter? And the last workout that you have to cross is 100 strict pull-ups for time, right? You don't know what's coming out of it. But those muscle patterns, the efficacy of motion, the ability to understand when I have fatigue and pull fatigue, and how I want to make sure to use my lats and my, mid traps as opposed to my upper traps, how I want to stabilize my shoulder with my infraspinatus and my supraspinatus. All of these things are common in both those motions. So if I'm working on the minutia of the skill as I'm growing it, I should be developing my skills into bleeding into other areas. It's like that low block example. I'm not just practicing a low block. I'm practicing chambers. I'm practicing isometric tensions to build muscle strength and coordination. When we start thinking about it, and what we need to try and convince athletes, it's almost convincing, right? It's like you have to suggest this hard to them because it is a almost revolutionary idea, even though it's not. Don't go so damn fast. Instead, save that. Save that for those moments, those fight or flight moments, those real life moments when things get big, but train controlled and intelligent so that you can start to glean as much off every motion that you do, so you're not wasting it. Don't waste time. Don't go to the gym just to practice pistols. Figure out what's wrong with your pistol. Figure out what that base position is. Figure out what that mobility is, and spend time there instead of beating the living shit out of yourself in a pistol until your leg can't function, and then it affects your training throughout the rest of the week.
Yeah, taking it back to a competitive advantage, I believe that one of, if not the biggest competitive advantage, I know I said this about breathing and mindset, but truly one of the biggest is staying injury-free for a season, right? And so staying injury-free has a lot to do with your movement quality, which has a lot to do with your tissue quality, right? Both of those are extremely important. And to use your example of throwing a ball, it makes sense to start by throwing slowly, perfecting your throw, and then picking up speed. It makes sense to perfect your pistol, do it a little bit faster, a little bit faster, a little bit faster, until you can do, 1-2 minute sprints with an Airdyne bike and pistols at game speed. And then you take that into competition, having prepared yourself properly, rather than just going in there like a bat out of hell with terrible technique. And you can do really well, you can compete really well, but your risk of injury goes way up. Your risk of damaging muscle tissue in a competition and messing up the rest of your competition is also much higher. So
100% agree.
I'm on board, man. I'm on board.
Recovery is the name of the game.
What does it mean to you? What does mastery mean to you?
So I think what it used to mean to me and what it does mean to me help tell the story of what I think it means to me. What it used to mean to me was, an expert, someone who just has so much skill and genius and quality in a specific area that they're the master. From a martial arts standpoint, it takes a really long time and a lot of devotion and obsession to become a grandmaster. And then as I think we grow up, at least in society, the way it's run so far, you start to see that the title of master gets thrown around an awful lot, like way too much. Mm-hmm. And it's even infused in our educational system, right? In the fact that when you get done with regular college, right? So undergrad, you have the opportunity to go then take graduate work. And so you spend a couple more years and you're given a title of master, right? Masters of Science, Master of Arts. Are you? I mean, I don't know. I really think that was what we were taught to believe, is that, by your early 20s, mid 20s, you should be in a position of being in mastery of a topic. And that's a dangerous thing.
Right. And if you're
what
not, you should beat yourself up about it.
Yeah. It's that's another part, right? Just the psychological damage of thinking, well, I'm not a master, so I haven't achieved.
I'm worthless.
No, you should not reach mastery until much, much later in your life's career. You should be always trying to seek those things, but mastery does not mean that you've focused on one type of knowledge base and become very acutely aware in that area. Cool. That's subject matter expertise, right? And that can be great, but there's still a difference between someone who says that they're an expert at something and somebody who everyone says is a master. So to me, what master is now is truly this realization that it is not just the self, and it's not just the skill, but it is the entire ecosystem of your everything. And I know that seems kind of hand wavy and bullshitty, but hang with me. If you're really good at something, the only real way to get even better at it, let's say you've reached the maximal capability of it, is to realize where parts of that entity could be better.
Right.
How can I improve
use coaching
a barbell
as an example?
So coaching. So let's say that I'm trying to teach an athlete how to learn a motion, and I get really good at learning all these different skills on how to teach the motion pattern. You're going to do these different lifts. You're going to do them in these combinations. And then over time, I've seen that they're going to improve your skill of movement. I can become very well equipped at knowing how to diagnose and say, this is how you should improve, your snatch. This is where you're messing up in the second or third pulls. But even more so, a master then steps back and goes, I want to talk about that ankle, because every time I watch you do this lift, I watch the ankle do X, Y, Z in a rotation pattern. And that concerns me. And then you get into, well, if I want to be able to understand the rotation of the angle, I need to understand the biomechanics of the person. So now all of a sudden I'm studying biomechanics as opposed to just studying the movement patterns that I've empirically collected by my own expertise of watching a million people move. And then I then go, I should probably understand the biological triggers that are causing damage and response to inflammation in this area that are causing this impingement in the ankle. So now all of a sudden I've got to be an expert in biochemistry. And it's this process that masters go through, where in order to be better at what they do, they get stuck on these gigantic tangents where they invest themselves into these, obsessive, deep, dark holes of thought and testing and performance to come back to the surface and be like, cool, I got something new. That's not what they're trying to do. They're not trying to become chemical experts and then try and revolutionize the way cells work. No, they want to understand how that system works so that they can still be great
to their craft,
at their art. And then you got to take that information as a master. The last little piece of this and then share it. Right? It does not work if you collect all the acorns and don't give them to anybody else, because who does it benefit? Right. You? If you're a master, you will have realized that. You'll have realized that the importance is to give something at the end. I think experts still kind of protect, their cookies and their almonds because they don't want anyone else to have them. And that's not fair.
Because part of it is about the art, right? Like furthering the art.
It's not just furthering the art, but furthering the process of mastery. And I think that that's one of those things that kind of got broken along the process, at least from the way that I've looked at it. We kind of got into the situation where the idea of a mastership was designed to protect, the master of that art, that mystery, that trade secret that was developed, and allowed people to then share their skills and develop those skills in order to host a guild and produce a particular product for everyone else's consumption. And then suddenly people started seeing their cool things and started knocking them off and trying to do them in the same way or with a small twist. And they basically reach out to, the governments and the religions at the time to say, hey, how about you provide me some patent coverage? Right. I want to make money off of this still. Mm-hmm. And then all of a sudden we start seeing, I think, at least again, based on my research, we start seeing a disillusion of what the guilds were and how they were run. And they start becoming these, secret societies and corporations and entities that are driven by a consumer effect. And we see that mapped out here. You had kind of talked about the kids in school and stuff like that originally, and I said I'll save it for this conversation. But think about education. My wife is a program director for special needs kids. And so the kind of environment that she gets to have for her kids is entirely different than the rest of the teaching environments, because they have special needs that are then being worked through and around in order to help give them something. But the rest of the system is all based on these standardized tests. And these standardized tests say, are you an expert? That's what they're asking. Are you an expert in being able to take this equation that we gave you, plug and chug these few numbers, and then get the answer that we want you to get? Because now you're an expert at using all of these tools. It doesn't try and teach you how you created that equation. What are the historical references to it? How does the philosophy of the time influence the decisions that people made and why they made these empirical tests? How did they stumble upon this equation? How were they testing it over time? Let's say, since we've been talking about gas a lot, PV equals nRT. Pressure times volume equals your amount times your gas constant times temperature. Well, experimentation allowed us to understand how changes in volumes affected temperatures and allowed us to write these equations. If I give a kid that, PV equals nRT, cool, you memorize it, you can plug in a few values and solve it. But can you apply it then to your lungs? Can you understand what's changing when you increase volume and change pressures and how that's impacting your own physiology? Those are important skills that mastery fleshes out and pulls to the surface, because people are now trying to understand the whole depth of what came before in order to harness the power of the solution at the end. That's a byproduct of the same stuff we talked about with our CrossFit athletes, right? And athletes in general. I want it faster now.
Right.
And so the easiest way to do that is you cut out the middle chunk section, which is, I'm going to let you be an apprentice for a little while, and then I'm going to skip jump you to master. And you're going to present your master's thesis to me. What happened to the journey?
Right.
What happened to the requirement of old school masters where they force somebody to go to an entirely different school and learn from them? Athletes that I've had in the past, I anticipate eventually you're going to grow out of me. You should grow into another space with somebody else who's going to provide you a new lens and a new element to your training. If you're an athlete at the high end level and you don't have 3 or 4 coaches that are spread out a bunch of different expertises, you're only limiting yourself. It's not to say that you don't respect those who are in charge. If you appreciate the mastery process as a master, you're encouraging them to leave you. You want them to come back smarter. You want them to come back more equipped with things that you've never seen, because you want to start to be able to allow them to help you infuse those things into that development of the mastery that you started with. And so there's all of these changes to the ecosystem that say faster, 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 now, consumer, 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 as opposed to saying, how do we get people to truly understand how to be masters of their own realities and their own lives? Being a master at something forces you to reflect on every ecosystem and every environment, every exchange you've had in your life, because it challenges everything that you've learned. You cannot have a depth of connection to a specific skill if you have not considered it, even so much as how your childhood helped get you where you were. Mm-hmm. It's all there and it's all showcased, and it allows you to then explain those things to like your children. As parents, if our goal was always to shortcut everything and make it quick, what are our kids going to learn?
Right.
They want it now. They want participation medals. They want quick steps to victory. My son got a trophy this year from soccer. And when I was getting the trophies, one of the parents asked me, are you going to be getting trophies? And I said, I'm a James Harrison type. I don't believe in participation trophies, so I don't have a plan. They ended up ordering them, and Knox got one. And the first conversation we had on the way home was, I said, I want you to take this the right way. I don't accept your trophy. And he kind of stared at me like, oh, what do you mean? I don't accept your trophy, not because I don't think it's cool that you got a trophy, but to me, I don't think you've done enough to earn that trophy yet. You may deserve it, but have you earned it? Have you put in the work that says that that trophy is worth something of value to you? And I asked him, I said, what do you think that trophy represents? He's like, well, I played soccer this season. I said, do you think that's a reason? That because you existed, that you went to class, that you showed up, that you participated? Is that enough? I said, I'll challenge you. You haven't scored a goal all year long. You like to sit in defense the whole time, and you hate being on attack. If you score a goal before the end of the season, to me, I will think you have achieved and earned that trophy. Last quarter, last game, he scores the goal.
Nice.
I freaked out, big bear hug. I'm trying not, to be steely-eyed as the coach, but I couldn't help it. And I got home and I walked over to the counter and I grabbed him and I gave it to him. I said, you've earned this. And the amount of emotional connection for both of us in that moment to that trophy was immense. He realized what mastery starts to require of you. It's not just enough to show up and understand the details of the game and to participate in a winning team. Just because everyone else can get it together and you just happen to be not the weakest link entirely such that you can achieve, that's not mastery, that's participation. Trying to rethink that on how we deliver that to our children and to our athletes and to our friends and to ourselves, to say it's not enough to show up, it's not enough to participate. We actually need to invest ourselves in our skill and therefore invest ourselves in our lives. That's a bigger conversation that has to be had.
How does apprenticeship fit into this picture?
The original intent of apprenticeship, right, is that you were almost basically getting food and board to be able to make it through. Kids get food and board, right? They live around your house. They eat your pantries dry. But a true apprenticeship, I think, doesn't come just by being at beck and call of somebody else's pieces. What I found with the relationship that I had with Brian was you should be wrong an awful lot. And that person, that master for you, cannot let you scoot by. I think that mentor and master selection is massive. Being in an environment and an ecosystem where people challenge you willingly and always is a requirement. We cannot get ourselves stuck into a world where everyone goes like, oh, I mean, it was close. Nice try. Mm-hmm. What is close, right? What is nice try? To quote one of my favorite things from Whiplash, good job, right? The two most harmful words in the English language are good job. You cannot give somebody that. So a true apprenticeship is when you screw up, you get lit up. And that's not a bad thing. If you're starting to appreciate and understand the process, you'll understand why you get lit up. And when you get to the other end of the spectrum and you start getting towards mastery, you'll start realizing why you need to light people up. It's not because you don't like them. It's not because you don't care about them. It's exactly the opposite. It's trying to give them valuable information to correct course early. That doesn't mean that you're right by any means. And I think that's another part of it, is that even as an apprentice, you may get battled down and beat up. Doesn't mean you're wrong. Mm-hmm. That's just the ecosystem of thought. They're, talking about how DNA was found. When nucleic, which is a substance that was broken down basically from pus, was discovered, the individual who found it, his mentor was like, do it again, because I don't believe you. That's not rude. That's real. Go do it again. Prove that you can handle this, that this revolutionary idea is still real. And even when he was done with it, he's like, I'm still going to write a scathing report about how, debunkery this is. His master was rooted in his own philosophy, but it didn't change the apprentice. So as an apprentice, it's a two-way relationship. One, you need to be in an open critiqued environment. And way two is that you still need to apply that open critique to yourself with a sense of self-realization. I am in the know with this. While I may have been told I'm wrong, how about I instead look for the reasons I could have been wrong and the reasons I could have been right, and figure out where it sits in the middle. We ultimately get stuck in this principle of if somebody critiques us, it's all bad. Mm-hmm. It's not all bad. Find what you need. Bruce Lee, take what you need, leave what you don't, and add what's uniquely your own. That's a process of apprenticeship. That's that growth model that you have to go through. And as an apprentice, you got to do the dirty work. You got to do the uncomfortable stuff. You got to do the basic skills. Hero Dreams of Sushi is a great documentary where he shows that you spend all this time doing the egg sushi, years and years and years and years and years on just the egg sushi. Why? Not because he doesn't think that people can make sushi, but because he wants you to understand the most technical, basic detail. How does your hip move in this kick? How does your ankle roll in this snatch? The minutia, such that you can apply that to everything globally and really create some creative and novel masterpieces at the end.
And if you understand it in the smallest way, then you can apply it in a much broader sense, rather than trying to understand it with 50 different sushi rolls at once or 50 different movements at once.
Yeah, it's this reductionism policy that's worked super well with science, right? If you can't understand a problem, break it down into the smallest parts. And as you do, you'll eventually find a perforation in. You'll find a way in. If you look at your, a movement that you have that's going wrong, and you're like, I cannot figure it out. I've watched 1,000 times of this motion. I don't know what I'm doing wrong. Okay, break it down. Don't watch the whole motion, right? Watch your hip, watch your knee, watch your ankle, watch other parts that aren't even involved in it. Watch your eyes, watch your breathing. You will find a perforation if you go small enough, in the same way that people have figured out, quantum physics. They ask these really big, hard questions like, why are we spinning around this gigantic glowing yellow light?
Right.
Well, break it down. Get fine-tuned, get little by little by little by little, and suddenly you're going to find a perforation, you're going to find a way in, and then you're going to start to open up your ability to then zoom out from that situation. And that's where I think athletes need to start applying that, and human beings need to start applying that. Don't get wrapped around the axle of how big and hard the problem is. Go for what you know, start there, chip away at it, and really get intimately involved with it.
And for those of you listening, especially if you're coaches, don't hear this and think you have to go and teach all of your clients, right, as apprentices on the path of mastery, because most of them aren't, right? Many of your, I won't even specify anyone, I'll just say many people going into any sort of gym, they just want to get a good workout, and that's fine. But when you spot someone, whether they ask for it or not, when you know that they're striving for greatness, right? They crave to be on the path of mastery, then create that relationship where you can give them feedback, and they know that it's part of you supporting them on this path. And if you're an athlete and you want that from a coach, you have to let them know that you're on that path. And sometimes you have to solicit that feedback for yourself, because part of the problem is there aren't enough mentors out there. There are a lot of cheerleaders and not enough mentors, right? Regardless of the discipline, there are a lot of people that are either looking to just do a good job, or they're just telling people good job. And you can create that relationship by yourself by basically spelling it out. Hey, this is what I'm looking for. I want you to give me a hard time.
And I think too, when you talk about it from a gym standpoint, it doesn't mean that you have to give away the ghost either, right? You don't have to say, oh, well, this group of people, I'm just going to, let them go because they just want to come here for a good workout. Mm-hmm. It's in how you design the ecosystem. Like you said, I'm going to, if I'm a coach, then I'm going to do it this way. I'm going to come right out and say it. I say to the athletes now, straight up out of the gates, this is not a small fix. It's not going to be you go into the games next year kind of thing, right? We are going to go on a process, and you may not want to be on that process. Some people choose not to be on that process for very long.
Right.
You find what you need when you need it, and then you leave. But I'm going to promise you that it's going to be like that. You coaching a gym, coaching athletes, right? Give them that same world. Make them realize that they may not necessarily like the extra 5 minutes worth of skill work that you do at the beginning, but you make it known from the beginning. I'm teaching this way because I believe in giving you a greater depth to your performance. I'm still going to get you sweaty. I'm still going to make sure that you get your fitness goals, but at the same time, I'm going to make sure that you can do this for a lot longer, because your objective shouldn't be, again, think about it as a business. If everyone wants to just work out, and you know that the probability of risk is going to go up based on people training for the sake of training and not training intelligently, and you want to be able to maintain your numbers, it only makes sense, right? So you can't argue from, well, it's not financially feasible. Absolutely it is, if you want to look at it that way. It is always good for the bottom line and for the entire infrastructure and the culture to say from the beginning, we are a place that wants to move well. We are a place that wants to consider the holistic options. We are a place that's not going to shy away from walking up to you and saying, drop that weight. Like, don't let some athlete take a 135-pound snatch if they can't do a 75-pounder. Don't let them do it. Mm-hmm. That's your job. That's your responsibility. That's your domain. You're the master. They're the apprentice in that situation. And you tell them and you let them know, because they're expecting you to be the expert, to be the master. And you get to decide, am I going to be an expert coach or am I going to be a master coach? Am I going to teach them to teach themselves, or am I just going to force feed the answers to them? Empowerment versus enablement. It's always been a big game.
Yeah, thank you for that addition. I totally agree. I wasn't looking at it that way at first, but I do fully agree with that. If you create that type of culture, people will, it changes the way that they believe, what they think of themselves, right? What they're capable of. And I think even if someone thinks they're just going there for a good workout, right? You can change what they're there for, right? And you can make them just take things a little more seriously.
You can. They follow example, just like anybody in the world.
All right, brother. This has been great. We're up against time. I think we got to do a part 2 and talk about emotions and all that kind of stuff. I've got a few rapid fires for you, and then we'll get out of here.
All right.
What book have you given as a gift most often or recommended to others?
Probably The Alchemist.
Ooh, love it.
Yeah, it seems ironic because I usually like the hard, nitty gritty books. But that one, and then honestly, if you want to get nitty gritty, Sam Kean's got some good books like The Disappearing Spoon and some of those things to check out.
What's a belief that you hold that if others held would have the biggest effect on their life and or performance in general?
To hint at the possible part 2 solution, I think your ability to realize that you live in a constant prediction for tomorrow or for the next moment, and you don't actually live instantaneously in a moment, is a big deal. By knowing that you live in a prediction, it means that you can control it. So there is some equation, just like that exercise system we talked about at the beginning, some algorithm that's controlling it. And the cool part is you decided that. So if you decided that, and that's what you can control, that means you can control how you're going to make that next possible outcome look, and how you decide to then use it to fuel the rest of your structures. And that means that you're always in control. As much as you feel like you're out of control, you're as in control as you want to be.
So going along with that, what's one action that you'd recommend people take?
Always, always, always be very thoughtful in how you examine something that's happened, and do so often. If you have a stressor during the day, or success or not success, it doesn't matter. You should look back on it and go, what did I do? What did I do right by my rules of right? What did I do wrong by my rules of wrong? How do I then associate values and how important those things were with me? You want to undress and unpack all of those big decisions and even the small ones, because that's what's allowing you to change the pattern. Because if you don't know how you automatically replied to it, you have zero idea on how you're going to change it. So the thing that you can do every day is, even if it's just one thing, one big choice you made that day, give it 5-10 minutes, not 12 seconds. Give it a real long, hard drive home where you're just rolling it over, figuring it out, trying to tell yourself like, hey, I could have done X, Y, and Z differently. And then try it next time, because you don't know if it's the right solution, and it may not always work. But if you don't try and understand it, you're never going to have a place to go to.
So when you're doing that, is it a mental exercise and kind of a almost meditative type way, or is it a journal practice? What does that look like for you?
I think it changes, right? And I think that's the benefit of it, is that you don't have to apply always the same rules. Like I've always made the mention to, I like how everyone goes, this is my daily routine. Cool. I've got 2 kids. My daily routine is survival, right? Like those are the things I'm going after. But at the same time, I do have those tools in my chest that I know I can use. I got a minefield journal is what I call it, where basically if there's a really interesting idea that I want to piece part of with and play with, I'll drop it in there. It's just a quick note. I called myself Batman on my cell phone. So I can text Batman, and I feel really empowered when I tell Batman my great ideas during the day. And even so much as the cold, right? Getting inside the cold that I do every single day. It's at least 4 to 5 minutes at less than 32 degrees. It's freaking cold. And I get in there and I can have a chance to focus and zone in. But sometimes it is just the drive in the car. It's being in your own head. Don't be afraid to be in your own head. You're in there an awful lot of the time. You might as well get personal with it. Don't think and waste your time on, man, I wonder what's going to happen on today's episode.
Yep.
No. you had today's episode, your real life show, figure out what happened, figure out what's coming next in the sequence. So even just chilling with your family, having these kind of conversations, having this conversation with you is another way that I do it, because there's so many things I've thought about since we started talking, so many things that I read to try and get ready for this, to make sure that I wanted to be able to talk about different ideas. I didn't know what was going to come up. I've got 4 different books laying out in front of me that I read and peeked at over the last, hour and a half before I got ready for this, all in preparation just to say, all right, play with your thoughts. What have you learned just this weekend that's going to change based on the last time you thought about this? So it's not just one thing.
That's great. That's great advice. I read a book called Deep Work by Newport. Have you read that?
Yeah.
One of the, there are so many knowledge bombs in that book, but one of the best things, it was so subtle, he recommends embracing boredom. Right. And so I especially associate that with my cell phone. When I'm at a restaurant and I'm with just one other person and they get up to go to the bathroom, what I can do, and I usually do, is pick up my phone so I don't have to be bored for 60 seconds. But since reading that book, I've tried to really embrace just being with myself, right? Just being there with my thoughts, looking around the room. That can be waiting in line somewhere. That can be in the car. We have so many moments where nowadays it's just so easy to constantly be consumed with our technology, and we've really lost the ability to be with ourselves. But when we are just being with ourselves, so much creativity and kind of new information comes to the surface. It's beautiful.
Brian had said it at one time in one of our conversations where he said, dopamine hits for clicks. That's the world that we live in, right? Mm-hmm. You can get an instantaneous moment of dopamine. Boom, here's a cat video. Boom, here's another cat video. In case you're not done, here's another cat video, right? And you can just live boom, 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 boom. But if you watch a kid, give a kid an iPad, right? I have great experience with this. Give a kid an iPad. Watch what happens to them in 30 minutes. Try and take that away from them. How is their brain? It is running on all nines, explosive and lost, because it is just basically not having to do much work to get all kinds of input. Mm-hmm. But then in reverse, put a kid upstairs, like in our case, we have the playroom upstairs. Tell them that they can't have anything to do. They will find something. Boredom will generate creativity, mm-hmm. and they will explore the world in ways that you didn't even think that was possible. That's the same shit you're made of, right? Stop acting like you aren't a kid anymore and that, now you're an adult and you can't play that way. No, that's you. That's how you're designed. That's how you're built. You just have chosen to always go for the phone because you know that there's a safety net in there. There's fear in having to consider what might be on the other end of staring at a wall for 5 minutes. Like, heaven forbid you have to think about yourself, right? Oh no, I couldn't think about videos. I have to think about how I treated my spouse today. Yeah, go think about that so you don't screw that up, Be there for your family, be there for your friends, be there for yourself.
I like to write really impactful quotes on my dry erase board in my office. I'm about to write, "Stop acting like you're not a kid anymore." That is fire. I love it, man. Cody, this was great, man. You're a philosopher. You're a highly intelligent guy, super successful, and this has just been amazing for me, man. I appreciate it. Where can people find out more about you?
I'm trying to build a blog. So when I get that ready, right now I'm just basically writing musings to myself to build up enough information to make it a much more responsible place. But until then, I like to every once in a while nag the world with my thoughts on Instagram. So my handle is Nerd Reinvented. Other than that, there's not a lot on the internet, to be honest with you. Most of my stuff is written on pieces of paper and in text messages. So
hell yeah, dude. Appreciate your time, man.
Yep. Thank you, sir. I really do appreciate it.
This episode is finished, but your training journey continues. Head over to brutestrengthtraining.com/SSW and grab your free pack of 32 accessory workouts that you can incorporate into your training and start improving your strength immediately. That's brutestrengthtraining.com/SSW.